First of all, thank you very much for accepting our interview. My first question will be about peacekeepers in Donbass. We know that Canada will take role in that. What do we know about that at this point?
Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. There's a lot of discussion about a peacekeeping mission. Ukraine has approached us about whether we'd be interested. Canada has, of course, a long history in peacekeeping, both military and civilian policing in peacekeeping. We've indicated a willingness to consider that, but that requires consensus of the main parties involved. That includes Ukraine, that includes Russia. There's, of course, a lot happening with the Normandy partners, Germany, France, US Special Representative Volker. We've been hearing some somewhat more positive noises out of the last round of discussions in Dubai, but it's still a long way from there to any practical invitation of countries or allocation of roles. So we're hoping that consensus can be reached, and we have signaled that we're ready to entertain the prospect of participation, but that'll depend on the main actors.
In the end of the last year, we've heard about the decision of Canada to arm Ukraine, to sell arms to Ukraine. What arms we are talking about, and what are the perspectives for this cooperation?
There's no online shopping list out there for this sort of stuff. What we're hoping is that in the training cooperation we have with Ukraine, that Ukraine, on the basis of that, will be able to identify the military technical needs that it's got, and that we'll be able to work together on addressing those. I think just this week we had a delegation from Colt Canada here thinking about small arms needs and production. But it has to make sense from the point of view of the overall reform and development of the Ukrainian military. We're not just out to quick sale, quick buck, send in some boxes of stuff and say we're done. It's a long-term partnership in training and support, and the same goes then for industrial cooperation on the military side.
Another big issue in Ukraine now is anti-corruption, fight against corruption. We know that Canada and other G7 embassies were quite active in criticizing and trying to influence Ukrainian government back in December 2017 in order not to allow them to change anti-corruption legislation. What are, according to you, the most effective ways to keep Ukraine on the good road of reforms of anti-corruption?
I'd say we're more on the influence side, and I think there is a need for countries to follow through on commitments. We try to do that vis-a-vis Ukraine. Ukraine needs to do it vis-a-vis things like the Venice Commission recommendations. Once you say, yes, thank you for the recommendations, we're adopting them, they should be reflected as fully as possible in the legislation. Some of it has been in the initial draft, but it needs work. And so we will be engaging with both the executive and the legislative branches to try and ensure that that happens. And I know certainly my colleagues, other G7 ambassadors, are very much engaged on that as well.
Canada is supporting Ukraine as well as any other countries from G7, but at the same time, there are some moments where this right moment to criticize Ukrainian government for doing wrong things. What is, and civil society is quite often asking international partners to interfere, to help, to maintain, I would say, this pressure on Ukrainian authorities. What would be, according to you, the balance between criticizing Ukraine and supporting Ukraine at the same time?
Well, our group was named in 2015 when the German presidency of the G7 created the Ukraine Support Group, as opposed to the Beat Up on Ukraine group of G7 ambassadors. So I think that's how we see our role. It's to be as constructive as possible in proposing modalities, solutions, but where we see that there's a danger of things going off the rails, to also point that out. But I think certainly our chairmanship The approach will be to engage in dialogue first, try and bridge the gaps, bring people together, and only then move to public statements. Events happen in all sorts of ways. Sometimes there may be a need to react to something overnight. I don't exclude that, but we've tried to set out an agenda that includes a range of issues, so as not to become totally obsessed with only one. Yes, rule of law, fight against corruption, but also economic growth, human capital development, effective governance, the civilian side of security and defense. So those are all things we're going to be looking at, and at different times during the year we'll be sharing both privately and publicly more of our thoughts on them.
Apart from the fight against corruption, what are the most important reforms in Ukraine, according to you, for the following year? What should we follow? Naftogaz, I don't know, economic reform, social reforms, etc.
I think medical reform, health reform will be very important. I think seeing some actual progress on privatization, even small and medium, and hopefully also some movement on large-scale privatization. If you think about where some of the big problems are now, that with where money flows in Ukraine, it's state-owned enterprises where that's focused on. So privatization is very important in that. Changes in the state fiscal service, because I think every taxpayer in Ukraine wants to have as constructive and good an experience in paying taxes or paying customs as possible. So I think a real emphasis on the sort of changes that Ukrainians in their oblasts, cities and towns and villages can actually sense and feel. Probably also, it may not happen this year, I hope it might, but progress towards land reform as well. Again, I know that's very controversial, but it's something that is of really great importance for rural areas in Ukraine, and rural areas have been contributing a lot to the economy and could do more.
Do you feel that Ukraine is somehow more successful in one domain of reform compared to another one?
I think there's been a lot done on reform of procurement, purchasing. By now, Prozoro is a bit overused as an example, but it is a great example, and one that other countries are looking at. I think a lot is being done on the defense side, changes, and there's this whole separate process, not us G7 ambassadors. There's a Defense Reform Advisory Board that's working on that at the strategic level, plus the various military contingents, US, Canada, Poland, Lithuania, UK, working at the tactical and operational level. So a lot of changes, but a lot of expectations. So how you balance that is the big challenge for Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian media, civil society, but also then international partners.
And maybe my last question about police reform. We know that Canada was quite active in helping Ukraine to implement this reform, but now there's still a lot of things to be done. How would you comment on this reform now in Ukraine?
It's one that happened very quickly, and when you think about it, from initiation to the first new patrol police was 7 months. Most other international projects, that's the time it takes for a preliminary feasibility study, never mind to actually put the first police officer on the streets. Now it's a matter of making it sustainable, bringing across the experience they need, and integrating it with the rest of the police force. Because you can't simply fire everybody. You need the people with 20, 30 years criminal investigation experience to get the results. So how do you synchronize the new people with the existing people, make everyone feel good, positive about what they're working on? That's what our Canadian bilateral police mission is working on. We've got 20 veteran Canadian police officers here, looking maybe to even possibly increase that in the coming year. So helping people work together and helping people move forward positively is, and helping solve crime, make people feel safer, that's our priority for police reform in 2018.
maybe the major thing here is the trust of the society toward the police, because as we've seen 1 month ago with the murder of Nozdrovska, that there is a huge critics about the police action, and there is a kind of mistrust of the society towards the police.
Yes, but if you look at the polling, it is considerably lower than it was 3 or 4 years ago. So I think the trust is more or less around 40–42%, which compared to 10–12% is a lot more. Naturally, every police force encounters incidents where people ask why is it investigated this way or that way. There's a need to talk to people, explain things, but also sometimes a need to maintain operational operational security, so that you don't simply put every last piece of evidence out on the internet. So again, that's something that I think our police trainers are working with the Ukrainian police on. How do you make that work? And again, it's not going to work perfectly every time, but I see the overall direction of change as positive.